This is a loosely coupled show with James Hickey and Comartin. If you're new to this channel, we chat about software architecture and design. Make sure to subscribe to get all our latest episodes. So what happened was we record these things like every few weeks, James and I, and James usually comes up with a pile of topics, and then we just pluck a few out of the meeting invite. And we did one last Friday where we were talking, well, the one I posted today. And then the last one we were about to record was about your blog post. And then somewhere
I had screaming kids coming home, and I was like, "Oh,
yeah, this is bad news.
Gotta cut it off."
So then we thought, well, okay, let's cut this off, and I'll reach out to you to see, hey, we were talking about your post anyway, so let's get it from the person that wrote it.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. I'd be interested to know what you guys feel about it, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't think there'll be any big surprises. I can guess, I think, how James feels about it. So yeah, I guess just to kick it off, James, you're the one that wanted to obviously talk about it, so I'll let you lead the way.
Yeah, sure. I'll introduce you, Andrew.
Yeah,
it's
nice
nice
let's start with that.
to kind of have that. Some marketing is kind of nice. So yeah, I mean, anyone in the .NET space probably knows who you are. I'll just say that as kind of a general statement. Personally, I've benefited from your articles quite a bit. I remember once there was some issues with, I think it was Razor components, or I don't even know what they're called anymore. This was before Blazor, so they had like Razor views and then kind of this half thing.
Oh, the view components.
View components, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there were some changes with from version 2 to version 3 or something like that. I kind of forget exactly, but there were some kind of nuanced things that you needed to know about them and to get them to work and things like that. So that really helped me because I had spent like a few hours trying to figure that out on my own. And then I remember like going to that article and seeing it was just like, one thing you have to add to your CS project or something silly like that. And that was really nice. Anyways, yeah, I've been reading your articles for quite a while, a number of years, and I'll just shout out. We'll probably put a link to your website in the notes and whatever, but it's andrewlock.net. It's pretty easy to remember. And I mean, from what my impression is generally that your articles are very hands-on, which I really like. It's very like, here's kind of a specific issue. Let's tackle that. Let's solve it. Lots of code, lots of explanation, which I really, really like. I really enjoy your articles because I find that they go in depth enough into like the specifics of the problem you're solving, but they're not, it's very like focused, and you're not kind of like going out on all these tangents, which is nice.
I appreciate it. Yeah, it's basically any time I've run into a problem at work, pretty much. I stick it in a blog post because someone else is going to run into the same problem. So
yeah, definitely. It seems. Correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like you've been writing a lot about, let's say, like HTTP kinds of things in the past while.
Yeah. It goes through stages. It depends. I've got a big backlog, and I mean, most of the stuff I do is API controllers. I don't actually do much Razor because we use single page Angular apps on the front end, so it's pretty much all HTTP, and we haven't bought into gRPC for any other synchronous messaging or anything like that. So it's all HTTP and then Kafka or RabbitMQ on the service messaging. So everything will be around that.
That's cool. So I'll give a shout out to your book, ASP.NET Core in Action. Are you on like the second edition now?
Yeah, I'm in the process of doing the second edition at the moment. So it's writing it for 3.1 and then updating it for .NET 5 when that comes out in a couple of months.
Yeah.
And then
the first time
yeah, it's probably with .NET kind of it is the case that in the last few years .NET has been really changing a lot in major ways very quickly. So definitely I can see how that would be a lot of work. Going from even to version 2 to 3 is still quite a number of changes.
Yeah, I think 2 to 3 is, like 1 to 2 is obviously a big change. 2 to 3 is, with the endpoint routing, that's a moderate change. I think 3 to 5 should be pretty simple, actually, if you're going, if you're sticking along the normal route. If you're doing Blazor or something like that, obviously there's big changes, but yeah.
Yeah, it seems like more of a marketing, not just a marketing thing. I mean, it's nice that they're bringing like everything in to one, but I guess that seems like the big changes. I mean, so they say, bringing everything into one kind of cohesive bundle.
Yeah, behind the scenes work, really. Yeah,
exactly. So let's, the article that we were going to talk about originally was the testing MPC controllers article that you had written. And I mean, you can kind of introduce the topic if you want. I guess we kind of have our own thoughts about why you would do that or why you might not and how that works.
Sure. So the article was basically in response to just some Twitter messages and things going around. Khalid Abhagma had a post in which he had said, like, integration tests are, one integration test is worth 1,000 unit tests, essentially. And some people got a bit upset about this was like an anti-unit testing or something like that. And I was working on the testing chapter for my book, actually, and I was looking at this, trying to test controllers, and I just got stuck. I was like, what am I actually trying to test here? I couldn't quite figure it out because a lot of the actual things which you'd be interested in are all provided by the framework. So model binding is external to the controller, routing is external to the controller, validation, depending on how you do it, is external to the controller. And they're all things which ideally you'd like to test, but you don't do them inside the controller. And all of the examples for testing controller are all a sort of the thick controller style where you inject EF core data DB context into the controller and you create an entity and you return that entity directly in the HTTP response, all the sort of stuff that I don't find that you just don't do in practice. It's great for sample code and you can do some testing of that, but even that gets a bit gnarly. Like, you have to do a lot of mocking, and I'm just not sure what the benefits are to trying to unit test these controllers. And if you take the thin controller approach, where if you're doing CQRS, or you're just using Mediator and you're just farming off a request as a command or a query into Mediator, then there's not anything to really test there other than you could test that you have sent a command. But again, that feeds into, I feel like a better approach would be to do that in an integration test where you actually test that a given HTTP request triggers a particular command. So it doesn't have to be the full stack that you're testing in an integration test. It could just be a subsegment, but you're still testing the whole ASP.NET core bit of that.
Yeah,
So
I think
that's pretty much.
Yeah, I think pretty much my thoughts. The only thing that I think that gets in the way, and especially on Twitter or wherever the discussion comes up, is they're so shallow because there's no context to them. So it's just what you alluded to. You gave some context. So it's like, it depends what you're doing. Like if you have thin controllers and literally it's just delegating to something outside of the controller, and you're in, like, as a person reading the kind of the discussion, your blog post or whatever the case may be, you have to fit it into how you write your apps, or the apps that you're writing and what they look like. If they look at like that and they're just immediately delegated to something else like Mediator or another type of dispatcher, then you could see, well, I don't do this. It serves no purpose for me to test individually just a controller. But if you're not doing that, then when you read, I don't test controllers, you'd be like, what? Right? So there's just a lot of context to how you're writing apps and whether it makes sense or not. And then there's a whole different discussion on whether the whole fat controller, thin controller thing. I mean, if anybody listens to anything I say, then you probably know where I stand on that. But I think it just depends. So I think a lot of these discussions initially, that's why I like our discussions, obviously, because they're talking a little bit more about these things than just these small blurbs on Twitter. So yeah, I think it's just perspective of what people are doing, and some people have, I guess I almost want to say sometimes problems that they don't, I don't want to say that they don't need to have, but it's just depending on how your app's written, kind of the patterns and architecture that you're following, that whether this is even a conversation or not. Right? It's like, oh, do I need to test controllers? It's like, well, depends what you're doing, because otherwise it's not even a thought, potentially.
Yeah, I like what you said, Andrew. Like, for example, if you have a controller and you're injecting stuff, right? You're injecting a DB context or even like a repository or whatever. You can rewrite that or redesign it to instead have your controllers delegate to like a command, like you're talking about, whether you use mediator or whatever. But then it's kind of like you shifted the question now to the command. It's like, well, should I test the controller? Not really, because it's not doing anything. Okay, so I should test the command, but that kind of begs the question that you were originally asking, with having a DB context injected and all this stuff, and you're kind of back to square one if you kind of ask the same question, right? Okay, now I'm testing the command, but I'm doing the same. I'm mocking all this stuff again, so it kind of becomes this question of how do I get rid of all these mocks, because we've kind of just like shifted the issue down to the command, and that's kind of an interesting question. I think this problem kind of leads to is whether it's a controller or a command or whatever. If you've got these, in this case, it would be like I'll call them infrastructure related dependencies, usually like things that do I/O, like a database client. But then it's like, if you have a bunch of stuff you're mocking, sure, you could still test what you have, but like that code becomes very verbose, very gnarly. So what are your thoughts on that? I guess what's the approach you'd take in that case, where I'm assuming you don't just do the same thing with the controllers or with the commands, sorry.
Yeah, so there's sort of two parts to that, and you're absolutely right. Like, assuming that you do want to test your code, which we're sort of taking as a given here, you have to do it somewhere. So the thing is, if you test it, I feel like the further, if you're going to test with the DB context and things like that, and your code is architected such that you do depend on those in some way, then whether you get value out of mocking them and mocking those interactions I think it's something that depends. I really like some of the tests we do where we spin up integration database in Docker, and we do tests that you fire off a command and you test that everything is written. You can query it afterwards if you're doing, depending on how your things are set up. And you kind of can't get away from it. Those things are there somewhere. You have to either mock them or just accept them and, do full-on integration tests down to the database. But the difference is you don't have to include the controllers, and that is my main thing. You can, and depending on how you've written it, you may have to. But I think that there is value in sort of having that segmentation between the HTTP, ASP.NET Core routing, matching you to a given controller, to a controller and then a command or query, and then a separate integration task potentially which actually hits the database for the command and everything that entails.
Yeah, so you were going, like, you're alluding to it, I guess. I'm just gonna blurb my my feelings of what I think you're going to, which is, I've always said that every app that I've written, I mean, for work that ends up being some big monstrosity over the course of 5 years, is we're not writing a web app. We're writing an app for a particular domain, and it just so happens that we've decided that we're creating an HTTP front end for that. So the caveat there is, like, James, when you're mentioning, like, okay, where the distinction lies, okay, like, you got to test something. I think Andrew was putting on is that you've eliminated HTTP from the whole mix. So you have eliminated the framework. My always comment is, get the framework the hell out of my code. I don't want to touch HTTP context. I don't want to touch anything to do with ASP.NET Core when I'm testing my, like, handlers or whatever they are, right? If you're using something like Mediator or Brighter or whatever dispatcher, they're not even in play at that point, right? Because they're the ones just invoking your code. So it's not like you have when you're testing, it's not like you even have dependencies on those libraries that you're using, those dispatchers. And then the other thing I keep thinking about, like, because database is always a good one. And I'm not saying to not mock them, or I'm not saying to use them, but the thing that I hear the most related to databases is, well, they're slow, and that's an integration test, and I don't even want to get into definitions, but people will, like, say that's an integration test because you're testing that. My general feeling generally is you own it. It's your database. It's not like it's some third-party service that you can't control. Your code has to work with it. Testing against a mock database, say you normally use Postgres or SQL Server or MySQL, whatever the case may be, and you're like, hey, I'm going to use the SQLite provider or the in-memory one. If you're comfortable with the behaviors the same, then sure, but don't pretend that it is, right? Like, don't think that it actually is going to behave the same. So I'm good with mocking things that you don't own, but I would generally ask the question, like, when people think about a database, is it, but you own it. Like, you have to own it. It's an integral part of your app, just like the code is. Without it, it's nothing. So I always question people, like, they don't want to integrate with it. They don't want to touch the database during tests. It's like, well, I mean,
they do make it slower. You have to. It is considerably slow, depending on the size of the app as well. As your database grows and things like that, it can make a big difference. And it's not the same as, what you're going to have in production and things like this. Just the sheer quantity of data, you're clearly not going to have the amount of data, so you won't catch everything. But you get so much value out of actually testing with a database. I find we use Docker Compose for running integration tests against Postgres, and you just catch stuff that you wouldn't catch otherwise. I think
I'm with you. But at the same time, for full disclosure, I do mock the database in some places because I don't give a crap.
Me too.
Right? So I don't think it's one. Yep. It's like James.
I do too.
Yeah. It's like James.
Mockers
Anonymous.
It's like James and I talk about it all the time. It's like, it seems like everything people want things to be black and white, or it's like you do this or you don't do this. It's like, well, no. Like, I guess there's a lot of situations where it makes sense. It doesn't make sense. I guess it's just kind of looking at what the value is.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah, we do both, and everywhere we do both. It's because you get it. It gives you different value at different places. Yeah. In the same way that there is value in testing the framework part, because ultimately you're going to be getting requests that come through the framework. It's just if you can isolate in a similar way to where unit tests are isolating to just one tiny bit. If you could isolate the routing plus the model binding plus all of that, control a bit, and not having to worry about, does that cause the exact correct command to be sent to the database, and you can just separate those two sections of your app. I feel like there's value in that break there as well, which is pretty much what the article is about.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that, Andrew, especially with the term value, or asking the question, does this bring you value? And I've found that, or the issue I've seen, or should I say the struggle I've seen most developers that I've worked with have is kind of exactly that question. Is they know testing is valuable, even if they understand, okay, unit tests might be different than, let's say, integration. I've seen the struggle with like answering that question, right? How does this bring me value? If you're, if you're writing code that's kind of getters and setters everywhere, and maybe you're just kind of testing random stuff, or again, maybe you're mocking stuff and you're testing that this certain method on a database was called in a certain order, and like those, I forget what the term for that is, but does that bring you value? Or like, and for me, that kind of raises the whole issue of like, people talk about business logic business logic. And I know a lot of people, especially in like, when they think of like domain-driven design, there seems to be a big notion of all your business logic should be in your quote domain model, which should be this, in this case, a C# class, and that's where all your business logic should live. And in simple cases, maybe yes, but that's, we all know that's not true, because like a lot of times you have front-end validation. Again, this comes to trade-offs, right? It's not like one size fits all. It's like in some cases, you're going to want to do validation on your front end to save the cost of having to send that over to your server and then have your server recompute that validation. And then, eventually we want to kind of get into Kafka. I know it's an interesting area, which is cool that you use Kafka. So moving into, let's say, more distributed systems, definitely event-driven, which we talked about this on the video we released today. Even with a monolith, you can have an event-driven system even with a monolith. So like, I think what you were kind of alluding to was this higher level of integration tests. Now, does it bring you value to know that if a certain area of your system emits, or if you issue a command to a certain area of your system, you expect it's going to emit a certain event, and you expect that these other components, whether they're distributed or not, are going to have a certain reaction to those. And I'm sure there's lots of different ways you could test that, but I suspect with Kafka, you could probably just kind of like fire one command or whatever, wait for everything to propagate, and then just take a look at the log and see, okay, do I see that these events kind of triggered? That would be one way, I would think, but the issue is like even that interaction between the events and an event producing a reaction in another system, like that's business logic. Like that's logic that your business needs, that if I pay for my order, that's going to emit an event that causes the thing to be shipped. Like that's business logic. And filling out a form and having the front end tell me I have to fill in my first name, that's business logic too, right? So I think a lot of times it seems like there's definitely I see in the domain-driven design area, it seems like people try to shove as much as they can into this like one, then we conflate model with like objects, I guess maybe that's the problem, but even that whole orchestration of events is kind of really your domain model in the sense, like kind of in a conceptual way, right? Like there's still logic there. So yeah, I'd be interested to maybe get some insight into how you're using Kafka, so how you kind of approach testing those kinds of interactions too.
Yeah, so that's one of those bits where mostly we mock it, or stub, depending on how you look at it. You sort of have a boundary around did you send this message, or then that's normally good enough, because then you can essentially test the other end. You assume that Kafka will propagate that, and you assume that your handlers will pick that up. And we have some integration tests around, ensuring that we've got the topics set up correctly and that we can pull from them, and that sort of aspect of it. But then actually you just assume that you're going to get the message. And so you don't have to test that long-running process necessarily. I mean, obviously it would be better if you could, but that becomes slow and brittle and difficult to do, basically. And it's the one that I haven't had the bravery to tackle, frankly.
Yeah, I don't know if you really if you want to or not. Because I generally think of producers as something's happened. Here you go. I don't care who you are. I don't care if anybody picks this up. Right? I guess it depends if there's kind of process managers or sagas involved, and that's a little bit different. But just thinking about our own code base, it's generally just in a given, wherever an event is emitted, wherever that's published, we just check, did that thing get published? Not necessarily wherever, just in something stubbed out, but did it get published? Does what it got published with is what we expect it to send out? Is there anything kind of not incorrectly said on this thing? But other than that, there's no...
That's your test, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I always wonder, though, on the flip side, you said, okay, do I have the appropriate handler on the other side? There's not, there's really nothing to test that, it's there or it's not. You've written a test for it or it's not. There's not... I always kind of wonder myself, is there something that I'm missing here of, there's some expectation that something else is going to deal with it, but the general idea is that you don't really care.
Yeah, I think that's what it should be as well. Theoretically, I guess from the business, as James was talking about,
that's what I mean.
Business rules, there is, I guess, a business rule that says that will be picked up. But if you've got a test and there's a handler that listens to or that accepts that message, then essentially you're talking about a configuration problem at that point, where your handler isn't configured, and those they're difficult to test. And you can spin up your entire app and run it in memory, and we do that. We run Kafka in Docker Compose to just test a few processes, and you can do that, but it's a nightmare to set up, frankly, just getting all the URLs and everything like that. And you have to wait a long time for everything to spin up, because if you're spinning up Postgres and Kafka and RabbitMQ and, etc., those are slow, and there's no getting around that.
Yeah,
But again, there is value, in checking that you have got an end-to-end process there, so there is some value. It's just,
Yeah, it's because what James mentioned, it really smarts me. It makes me get that feeling again where I always say, there's something not quite right that I'm not thinking of. And he's putting his finger on it, which is there is this orchestration of things that have to happen to make the system as a whole run. And yeah, as a producer, you don't really care who the consumers are, but in code you don't. But as a business, you do, right? There is, there's this, if a part of the orchestration isn't working the way you think it is, then there is a problem there. And I never thought about how you just said it. It's kind of a configuration problem, which it could be if you have something that should be listening to an event, and for whatever reason it's not picking it up, configuration wise. So I guess you'd need probably something around that. But to say an end to end, okay, this emits, this kind of kicks off this whole long-winded, long-running process. And the expectation is all these things are going to, be emitted. I don't know if I've ever written a test for that.
I think that would be hard, because you've kind of designed it in a way. But like you've said, each context is basically responsible to just send an event and not care, which is that's the whole point of doing that, is so you don't care. You don't have to be tied to these other components in your system.
This is the sort of thing where if you set up, this is where people talk about, you run a unit test, you run your integration test, and then you deploy to a UAT environment, and it's essentially a full environment, and you're automating big processes at that point. You're testing the whole system. And I feel like that would be great, but that's not something or like automated complete testing of the entire system is not something I've ever been involved in. And I feel like, the Ubers of the world, etc. Like, yeah, they have that. I'm sure they have that. But we don't have testing everything and testing an end-to-end process, through the entire system. That's a lot of integration.
And definitely it would make sense if you have like different teams owning different pieces of the overall system. If you want to say like team A owns this context and team B owns this context, and we're communicating via messaging, then I mean it makes sense that you're not going to want to spin this huge thing up, because now you're basically coupling everyone together again, which is kind of the whole point, is so everyone can not have to rely on each other and just do their own thing. But yeah, it makes me think kind of what you were saying, Derek. It reminds me, even if you think of like mocking, let's say you have a command and you have various things that you've mocked. Again, like there's still, going with this concept of value. Generally, what I would do for like commands that have, let's say, a lot of things mocked, I generally will just treat those as kind of, I'll write like more of like smoke tests, I guess you could call them. I won't be like, okay, I'm going to test every single scenario that this command can handle. It's more, I'm going to mock all these things. I'll just kind of do some generic things to just make sure, everything kind of flows the way I kind of expect it to in a general sense. Definitely the more finer grained things, I'll probably have, again, like just like a C# object or whatever, some kind of object that I can treat as, in this case, the domain model, which I guess is an aggregate in most cases, to use DDD terms. But I mean, it's really just like, it's object-oriented programming. We just kind of throw all these terms around, but it's like, it's just object-oriented programming. It's a class that's not tied to infrastructure, and you can test it in isolation. I would definitely, in that case, will try to focus a lot of the nitty-gritty scenarios with those. But then, I think of like the command. It's like, I just want to make sure things are tied together generally, and just have kind of smoke tests against those, which is the value. I know it's generally gonna work, and I'm not missing something. But I think the same kind of would apply at the kind of the larger scale too, which is like, well, do you want to test the orchestration? In this case, it's not like in code, but it might be various pieces of a different, distributed systems, whatever. But then I think, the trade-off in that case is like the cost to, like you're saying, the cost to bring all that up as a test fixture, I guess, in a sense, kind of becomes your test fixture to have your entire distributed system hoisted in memory. Does the value outweigh the cost of having to do all that? And like you said, with bigger organizations like Uber, maybe they find value in that. But again, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question. I'm not going to give like a solid answer on. And again, it depends, right? But I'm not sure, like doing that, again, it kind of still couples you in a way.
It does.
Like
and then,
somebody has to know about where everything fits if you're going to do that, right?
my immediate thought of all this is like the exact opposite, which is like, do I know what I'm developing is autonomous and doesn't rely on anything?
Yeah.
Or it is of itself. So it's like, depends how you're thinking of this whole thing. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Loosely Coupled Show. If you did, please subscribe for more on software architecture and design.